I'm Lau Branson, and as we're beginning week 6 in the course Missional Churches and Leadership, we're going to be focusing on social context and especially at the boundary crossing issues we raised earlier, matters of diversity, the normal tendency for humans often to turn inward. Especially happens during times of anxiety and uncertainty, whether that's larger in the society or even just in a particular church. Certainly, our culture, our society over the last year has seen an increased amount of this kind of turning inward or not wanting to deal with values and engagement of diversity. But it's also to acknowledge this is not easy. It does take work. The First of all, I want to go back to the video and the article that you read last week that was concerning the church in Oakland. There's many things about the church and even things I'd mentioned in the article that were our own challenges, but I wanted to at least let you see some ways that a particular church was living this out, and even hoping that because it's a little bit older, it was far enough away where you could be looking at it and observing, knowing that it was a different time. This would have been, like I say, in the mid-90s. So just some summary things out of some of your discussions in your Blue Jeans discussions and other conversations I've had. One was that just the participation in the worship service did show diversity of age and ethnicity, kids feeling free to engage, to be themselves, engaging each other. The church's attentiveness to the context is what resulted in this kind of participatory, diverse life together. The worship expressions during the video of singing and prayer and dance and communion, all very participatory and not a sense of performance, just was something that was important to us. And all of this was shaped by a particular mission covenant group, as was described in the article, that the Celebration Mission Covenant group both worked in the community in doing celebratory things like block parties, but also they were the consistent leaders in how we spent our Sunday morning hour and a half. Leadership is plural, as you see, so anybody coming in would notice that was also diverse. Not only you don't see it, but the behind-the-scenes work of a group of people, none of them pastors, who designed the worship services, and then how the rest of us participated in that. And so you saw different leaders with music and dance, the sermon, the communion table. And the article intentionally points out how the leadership triad, actually that theory arose out of the way that we were doing that work. The music, the behaviors, the rituals were both traditional and innovative, both formal and informal. If I remember right, there are 15 or 16 songs sung during the 90 minutes, of which about a third had been written by different people in the church, especially those around the communion liturgy. Also, the ways that you would see kids having, and even older people, having instruments, percussion instruments. So each aisle of the church had percussion instruments in them. And so the kids were welcome to participate in that more noise-making, rhythm-making way. And this also let them learn how to follow a leader, because we would note to them, watch the bongo player, the conga player, and when the conga player is playing, you can use your instruments, and when he's not, then keep them silent. And so they would both learn to participate and learn to work with a leader in a music situation. Diverse music, hymns, songs, spiritual songs, what was then contemporary music. So again, just a diversity of things that represented who we were, our own church traditions as a United Methodist Church, but also the more recent context. Neighborhood kids were welcome, and we would frequently have kids who were there without their parents, some very troubled situations at home. Whenever somebody under 18 visited, we would make sure we connect with them and connect them, introduce them to adults. Kids younger than, I think it was 10 or 12, needed to have a pew pal. Now, they could either sit with their parents, but even our own kids were given pew pals, which meant some other adult in the church that they could sit with. And they needed to either be with their own parents up to a certain age or with their pew pals, so we would always know quickly where to check. But there are also security issues in an urban environment, so we were very aware that if parents were trusting their kids to us to come, that we needed to be watching out for them. And so also we introduced newcomers there at the end, just a way to common in churches to make connections in the midst of other announcements. And these were usually guests of members of covenant groups. Occasionally we'd have other people that just are curious about us and walk in. The structures, as you notice in the article, serve both the inward life of the church and the outward life. So every mission covenant group needed to have an expression in both ways. And this was often a challenge. And so you saw how we worked at discernment and experiments, what now is part of the practical theology work that I do. And so those were just certain things between the article and being able to observe at least Sunday morning life. Obviously, there'd be much more if you could have a camera follow around a group during the week. But the diversity issues there raised became part of my own teaching and then the writing that I did with Juan Martinez. This is from that book. What would happen in a church if they believed that the missional imagination of God was among the common everyday members of the church? How would participants respond if they engaged Scripture, neighbors, and the Spirit with an expectation that God would reveal a missional life right in their context? Imagine clusters of church members continually organized around missional opportunities in the neighborhood and along the church's relational networks. Consider what would happen if a church's members came to believe that they are not only supporters, but also that they are at the very heart of God's missional presence, that the Holy Spirit can give them insight and passion and gifts to be agents of God's gospel. So that's what we're working at in missional ecclesiology in these contexts. In the middle section of the book, as you're getting into, we're looking at particular socio-cultural perspectives because we're aware, again, that this diversity issue isn't simple or even intuitive. And so we're trying to give concepts that then can be put into experiments and into practice so that, as a lot of you commented last week in your postings, that the diversity issue is often one of the more challenging things. It becomes too thin when we're just thinking of food and brief encounters and music, the kind of the consumables of a culture. And so what Juan and I wanted to do was go deeper than that. So we're looking at worldviews, we're looking at language and gestures and power, looking at different definitions of social relations, how self-perception and individuality varies culture to culture. Even the ways we perceive and think vary culture to culture. That's why we often think we're listening and we're not hearing what the other person is communicating or living. We're not seeing the world through their eyes. And so in the chapter on life worldviews, we draw mainly on Jürgen Habermas's work. And so this is a table there on page 100. And so pay attention to this because not only does it matter on how we get into the eyesight, the perceptions of another person, but also then eventually it leads to significant work in chapter 9 where we deal with communication. So this is all coming out of Enlightenment frameworks. Jürgen Habermas is always fairly negative about imagining there really is much of a postmodern shift. And instead, he says we haven't taken advantage of some of the resources of modernity, particularly how it can help us communicate better. And so he often was working in this particular theoretical work with trying to capitalize on some advantages of Enlightenment frameworks. And so as Juan and I developed that, Habermas will talk about the objective world, the subjective world, and the social world. And so the objective world is the generally available propositional knowledge, things that all of us can see, can learn, and that it's generally available rather than simply something that one person can see. But the subjective world is the interpersonal world, or the personal world, what I can tell you about my own narratives, what I can tell you about my own feelings. And so that's a different world that I've got access to. It's very real, but others, it's not objective in the way that it doesn't, others don't have access to it unless there's a way in which I reveal it. But it's still just as powerful. It's still just as real in any group. The social world is the way then the several of us decide to live together. The ways we are currently practicing certain things, and so norms are developed, but then also the way we move toward different norms. And so a social group has norms and intentions. And so the types of speech on each of these, the objective world, it's descriptive speech. We describe, we use language that we can share to describe something. The subjective world is expressive. I'm telling you my story. I'm telling you my feelings. The social world is regulative. It's about oughts. It's about here's what we're going to do together. And so these different frameworks help us start understanding the differences in cultures between our objective, subjective, and social worlds. And so back to that middle section, as you read through them, in each one of these, we're describing some particular concepts. We're telling stories around those. But the other thing we're doing is we're constantly using frameworks of Middle America as a way to say, here's what kind of Middle America, middle class, you could even say 1990s, as these frameworks were being developed. And so it's a way to understand the particular cultural realities. It's simply as a way to help establish some differences. And so, for instance, and I'd encourage you to do this, let's just look at relationships. Middle American relationships in general assume an egalitarian, assume middle class. They assume that relationships lack permanence or depth in relationships, that you really do move on to new relationships as you're expected to move from home into new jobs, into new locations. Often there's a miss of social cues and power cues in other cultures, that because of our egalitarian, and I'm owning this as most of my own background, that will miss the fact that there's something going on generationally or status-wise that we simply aren't clued into. There's a priority on the individual identity over role. So while I have a job, I still think there's something more to me than simply that I'm a professor. Ethnic inequities are subsumed. We pretend they're not there, even though we're probably getting better at identifying those. There's an acceptance of difference in skills and achievement and rewards, and those are just assumed within the culture, that there's variability there. There's an emphasis on equality of opportunity rather than equality of beginning of achievement. We simply say, everybody's got the same opportunity, that's what really matters, and of course, often that's not true when it is claimed. And so we have these ideals, and these ideals exist right alongside the inequities. Let's go across to the other column for a minute. Other cultures often have class structure. There's status and relationships that endure over a significant period of time. Obligations are structured into groups rather than something that are more malleable. The role and the person are aligned, while in Middle America, like we say, those are not necessarily so. There's often clear hierarchy. There's established social norms. There's predictable patterns among relationships that are socially determined. And so, as you look at these different descriptions that Juan and I offer between Middle America and other cultures, I'd suggest that you keep notes that would then move into this third column and talk about your own tendencies. So here I note on the first part of this chart that I tend toward being informal rather than formal. I frequently ignore social cues around status, sometimes intentionally, sometimes because I am clueless. I like to challenge social relational norms. That's simply part, I don't know how much of that's personality and how much of it's culture. I work against social inequities that are part of my culture. But as a white male, I have immense privileges that give me space to make these kind of choices, to be involved. And so I'm aware, at least some of the time, of what goes on in the way that my culture isn't at all close to the ideals that it advances. So my suggestion as you work through these chapters is take notes, make sure you're seeing some of the things that Juan and I are explaining and illustrating, and then take notes for yourself and for others in your church group, your other social groups. Simply start becoming aware, but also raise conversations about these things with others. Just say, here's something I'm studying about myself. Is this what you would observe to be true? How would this work for you in your culture? And it's that kind of engagement that continues to broaden our perceptions and broaden our choices and our practices. You'll also be listening to some more videos. Some other friends, Pastor Carson's, Doi and Fong are working at these issues in their churches, so you'll be able to hear some more brief video clips that relate to the book. And so as you do this, again, taking notes, be meditating on this particular question, to think about an experience or conversation with persons of a different culture. So using critical reflection on you and your own culture, name something you've learned about your culture that you had not been aware of. whether it's in how you think, how you perceive, how you relate. So as you work through these chapters, see if it will actually give you the capacity to have surface something that is new for you to perceive in the book, in your reflections on the book. Then reflecting on what you've heard from others, name something you've learned about another culture. I'm fairly confident all of you have had time to have conversations with people about other cultures. It would also be probably worthwhile as you read this material to be doing that and bouncing these ideas off others and learning about their cultures. And then finally, has your understanding of God's grace or the gospel or Missio Dei been changed by a person of another culture? Has your theology been messed with? So you actually, because of the eyes of another person, you're able to see things that you couldn't see before. So all of this is this constant action reflection. You come in with certain experiences and beliefs about border crossing and diversity and ethnic diversity. You're constantly engaging theory in this class, and then out of that comes some new awareness. But also be aware that in class we're constantly working with this kind of action reflection. It's the return to action that becomes harder, because at least in the way that we're constructing this class, I'm not actually requiring you to go do a new experiment, to change a behavior and work toward changing a habit, although perhaps that would be something worth doing. And so you can get as far as naming something that you think would be a good experiment. And so on any of these, the issues that come up, you can be aware and even name in your journals, name in your group engagement. Here are some things I want to try. This would make a difference. Not only along these lines of diversity, but the other issues we're hitting in missional church theology and practice. So that's where we're going this week. We're pushing into diversity more because it's this awareness, it's an engagement, because we are saying that God is already engaged way beyond our perceptions, and often we're especially not aware of it when the cultures are different, because we haven't developed the perceptions for that. And so it comes with the being aware of God, God's initiatives, being aware of neighbors as subjects, and then how these concepts around diversity can help us push further, gain new competencies and awareness. So have a good week. We'll continue to push into this, and we'll especially be putting more emphasis into some of the leadership concepts that have been accumulating as we're going along. Take care.